This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by Andrew Bevan, the 2025 Liberal Party of Canada Campaign Director.
Thanks so much for joining me, Andrew.
Oh, it's so good to see you, Teresa.
Okay, so we're here today to talk about events of a year ago at this point. So last year, Canada was thrown into an election. I think, at the outset, perhaps most people didn't necessarily know how it was going to turn out. There was a big lead up into that election where I think a lot of people thought the result might have been the opposite of what it ended up being. But you had a front row seat in that election. You were the Liberal Party campaign director. It was a job you took, I think, about 6 months before the election actually happened. It was a very different environment that you took it under than the one you actually performed the job under. When you took the job, this was about, fall 2024, the Liberal Party was way down in the polls. Pundits, predicting certain defeat for the party, that this was going to be a historic loss. Why the heck did you say yes to doing that job?
Well, first of all, I have to say that it's hard to believe it's been a year since the federal election happened.
Yeah.
It's just time has flown by. But a very good question. So the Prime Minister Trudeau called me on Thanksgiving weekend, the Friday night of Thanksgiving weekend, to ask me to be the campaign director. And I wasn't a total surprise, I think, first of all. I was part of the group trying to think through and give advice to the Prime Minister as to who should be the campaign director. But I was not advocating for myself, though, in that process.
I was going to say, you didn't pull a Dick Cheney here, right?
No, I did not. But I'd gone back to Ottawa a year prior to that, in October 2023. I'd been asked to go back and be chief of staff to the deputy prime minister and the finance minister, and also be a senior advisor to the prime minister. So sort of a bit of a double-hatted role. My good friend Jeremy Broadhurst had left the role of campaign director in late summer of 2024. Jeremy and I have known each other for 25 odd years and been friends and colleagues along the way in very many different ways. But we'd been thinking about who would replace Jeremy over the course of a few weeks, and so it wasn't a total surprise that the Prime Minister called. So a couple of things involved in thinking about accepting the role. First of all, if the Prime Minister of your country calls you and asks you to do a job, it's usually well advised to say yes.
Yes.
For both practical and moral reasons. I mean, on the practical side, no one ever wants to hear that you have turned down something the Prime Minister has asked you to do. And secondly, I honestly believe, I've been an activist and a member of the Liberal Party, both provincially and federally, for decades, and I like to think of myself as being a soldier for the Liberal Party in this country. And so, in a world where it was not the most attractive job to be offered, that's for sure, I was always going to say yes to it. But underneath that, I mean, I actually, I guess I'm an optimist at heart, but I'm also not naive. I'd like to think I'm a realist while being an optimist. This was Thanksgiving of 2024, an important date because it was prior to the US election. Trump had not yet been reelected. In my view, at that time, he was going to be reelected, and I certainly thought that would upend politics, both at home and abroad. I mean, not just in Canada, but globally, but especially in Canada, and that we would experience at least what we had seen and gone through during Trump 1. I would never have imagined that Trump 2 would have been exponentially more challenging than Trump 1, but in similar ways. But so in thinking that it would upend politics, I thought that would possibly present political opportunity, not least because I do believe that the Liberal government of Mr. Trudeau had done well in Trump 1 and had actually garnered a fair amount of respect about how from 2016 to 2020 the federal government had dealt with the Trump administration, had been successful in reaching an agreement on CUSMA. And I thought that would be something that would both be remembered and be useful in terms of the go forward, notwithstanding the very weak position the party found itself in late 2024. So, I never believe that defeat is certain, and I always believe there's a pathway to victory. Sometimes it's very narrow, sometimes it's broad, but it always exists. You got to identify it and then do the things that can make it happen. You'll remember this from our provincial days together. I mean, in 2014, nobody expected us to win that election, but we did.
That's right.
Of course, the counterpoint to that is in 2018, nobody expected us to win that election, and we didn't. But the point is that politics are what happens daily and weekly and monthly matters. It's not just that elections matter, context matters, and context matters especially for elections.
Well, I'm glad you brought up a number of points there that I happen to agree with. Like, I often say to people, despite all my experiences in politics, I'm an optimist about politics.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Because, there are some that should have driven me from this arena, but I am still here. And I'm glad you brought up 2014 and 2018, because yes, in both those cases, no one expected us to win. And in one of those cases, they were correct. Mm-hmm. But in the other, we subverted expectations. So I want to ask you about that past experience you've had, because not only did you work with Kathleen Wynne on those campaigns, but you also worked with Stéphane Dion back in 2008 as well, which was a crazy election campaign, and an even crazier aftermath of an election campaign than perhaps we've seen until now. What did those experiences teach you about campaigning, and how did they help you prepare for 2025?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd actually go back even further than that. I mean, my beginnings in politics, working in politics. By the way, I never even knew the jobs were possible in politics when I was in university, etc. It's I found that out all of a sudden during the 1993 election, because I went and volunteered on that election campaign, as so many people do in terms of their entree into the political world, and then got a job coming out of that. But I managed local campaigns through the 90s and the early 2000s, both provincially and federally, a little bit municipally. So I'd had that campaign organization managerial experience, and been lucky enough over the course of time to put that together with some policy experience and communications experience. So sort of policy, communications, managerial experience all together in terms of what I've done in politics and government. So by the time 2008 came along, so I had just a brief history of that moment in my career. I had been the director of policy and communications for Mr. Dion in his leadership campaign, and then I became his chief of staff for a year, then his principal secretary for a year, and for that election campaign in 2008, I was the senior person on the plane. First time I'd been on the plane. I'd been at HQ before in the federal election, but I hadn't actually been on the plane. It's a different sort of experience for sure, and one that is well worth experiencing, but it's different than being on the ground in a campaign headquarters, either a campaign HQ or a local campaign. 2014 and 2018, I was a senior person on the bus with the Premier at the time. You're not often on the plane in the provincial campaigns, only a little bit, but certainly on the bus every day.
Who knows recently with everything going on with Doug Ford and his plane, but yes, I digress.
Well, who knows? It's still a bit of a small plane. It's up and down, that thing. Anyway, so those experiences all matter, of course. The other thing I'd point out is, not many people have been national campaign director for the Liberal Party of Canada. There's just a few of them, and so it's not as if there's a massive pool of people to choose from. So you have to choose people who have the various elements of experience of different sorts as you decide to appoint someone new as a leader to be a campaign director. Keep in mind as well, when Prime Minister Trudeau appointed me, he also appointed Marjorie Michel as a deputy campaign director, extremely accomplished organizer from Quebec. But in a national sense as well. It worked in PMO. She was just amazing to work with on campaign readiness for 2025. The other thing is, there's a whole superstructure in the Liberal Party of Canada that doesn't just support campaigns but runs them, no matter who the campaign director is. At the moment, in the last 10 years, that's been led by the National Director, Azam Ishmael, who's an incredibly accomplished campaign organizer and campaign director in his own right, supported by a large and accomplished team there. So it's not an individual role, and having done these things before, knowing what that entails in terms of putting the right team together and making sure you have the right structure and processes to allow things to work. I think those are some of the things you learn over decades of doing some of these roles. So certainly all of that experience matters. But every election is different. Every election as you prepare for them is different. This one was perhaps especially unique, but they're all interesting.
Is there a world where, I'm thinking of fall 2024. Is there a world where you were thinking, if the Prime Minister can just hold on to his position over the next weeks and months, then the Trump threat will come back to the fore and he'll be able to rise up? Like he was a great campaigner and he always really, really did well on the hustings. If he can just hold on into an election campaign or until, we turn the corner into the new year, his poll numbers will start to rise. Was that your thinking, or were
Absolutely.
you questioning whether that would happen?
No, absolutely. I thought that was a likely possibility. Extremely likely that his own personal political fortunes would improve. The question is, how much would they have improved? Would they have improved enough to win as strong a minority as Mr. Carney did? But I think that's debatable. But I certainly believed at the time, and I continue to believe, given the way things played out, especially over the course of November 24 to March 25, whilst Mr. Trudeau was still Prime Minister. I do believe that he would have certainly been able to run an election campaign because of the way he campaigns, but also because of the issue set in the context, in a way that would have allowed him to win a lot more seats than were expected in October of 2024. I have no doubt about that. The question is, to what degree?
For sure. I had the vantage point of being a voter in Toronto, St. Paul's. And even before that by-election ended, I thought Trudeau's career is over. And the reason I felt that was because it felt the exact same way I felt working for Kathleen Wynne when, we had the Sudbury trial, we had a whole bunch of things snowballing into an effect that people were just sick of her. And you'll remember the polling from that time. The policies were very popular. The policies she was going into that election in 2018 with were really, really popular, but people just didn't want her to be the one to implement them. And I felt very strongly that people were starting to feel the same way about Justin Trudeau. And when there's that gap in the polling gap between the ideas that person is putting forward and their program versus their own popularity, it's really, really hard to ever come back from that. Poilievre was very focused on cost of living issues at the time, which was a weak spot for that government. Did you have a sense of how you might, surmount that? Was it simply just, it'll all be about Trump, that won't matter? What was the time?
No, a couple of things. I mean, so let me start with the pedantic part of it to a certain extent. I mean, the number one priority for a campaign director, campaign team, and this was certainly true when Marjorie and I got there in the party office at the end of October of that year, was to put together all the pieces of a campaign in a practical sense. People and processes, structures, etc. Nominated candidates, all the pieces you need to make a campaign successful, no matter what the context is, and no matter, to a certain extent, who the leader is. So we were very, very, very focused on making sure all those pieces were coming together. We tried to accelerate what was happening on the candidate nomination front. Marjorie was in charge of that. She did an excellent job of accelerating that. We brought in some new interest, energy, and vigor in making sure there was a synthesis between the party, the campaign co-chairs, and what all those pieces needed to be in terms of how they would sing together once a campaign came along. So on the one hand, we're taking care of that. The more important question is, what was going to be the strategy of the campaign in terms of the way the world was playing out. Now, I would say that, from November, when Mr. Trudeau went down to Mar-a-Lago for that famous dinner, all the way through to when the new leader was elected on March 9th of last year. I think that Mr. Trudeau, as you know, Mr. Trudeau's polling numbers went up over the course of those 3.5 months. Now, some people will say, well, that's because everyone knew he was going and that he wasn't going to be the leader and he wasn't therefore going to be elected. Well, maybe, but I don't actually think people are that forgiving. I think they actually saw Mr. Trudeau elements of what they always liked about him in terms of standing up for Canada at a time of upheaval and tremendous threat from the US in January and February into March of last year. So I think the evidence itself shows that there were things that could be drawn upon strategically for a campaign with Mr. Trudeau as leader that could have led to some success. So that's the view that we had of the world, especially by the time we got into late November. At the same time, of course, there was all this activity ongoing within the caucus, especially, but within the party at large, as to whether or not Mr. Trudeau should remain as leader. All of which was exacerbated by Chrystia Freeland's move on December 16th of 2024, which made it very, very difficult for Prime Minister Trudeau to remain in place. And as you know, on January 6th, he said he was going to resign.
Just on all of that, because you had worked for Chrystia Freeland as well, so you knew her quite well, and you probably had a sense of her thinking around that. Does the Liberal Party need a better off-ramp for leaders? Because we don't really have a lot of constitutional options for members to trigger something like that. We don't have a lot of options for caucus to trigger something like that. Sometimes it is a case of, I think here too, Liberals didn't really want the Prime Minister to go because a lot of them, owed their seats to him. They owed this time in government to him. Even as party members, people really appreciate him. I think he's the most progressive Prime Minister this country has had. And as a progressive, I really appreciate everything that he did in government. Almost everything. Yeah. But, did we need a better off-ramp so that this didn't need to be so messy or prolonged? Or is this just how it shakes out?
I don't know. I'm in two minds about that. I think that politics to a certain extent is meant to be messy. First of all, it's politics is, first of all, is never linear, and secondly, it's not always rational. People are people, and people have views as to what should or should not happen when they work within this political sphere, and it plays out as it does. Now, I would also say that I don't think that the way things came to a real apex with Mr. Trudeau was necessarily the only way that there was to go. In real terms, for example, I don't know what would have happened, for example, if Chrystia Freeland had said to Mr. Trudeau privately that she was going to do that unless he was to figure out a pathway to be replaced. So there's all kinds of variables there. It doesn't have to be the way. It didn't have to go down the way it went down, in my view. There are probably other ways to reach the same conclusion, and I think there could have been other ways for a different conclusion, potentially, depending, as you said earlier on. If Mr. Trudeau had managed to hold on for a few more weeks, who knows whether that would have led to a few more months because of the way that the world was unfolding around him.
I wanted to ask about polling at the time, because I remember seeing the polling provincially in 2018. And at one point, the Ontario Liberal Party was going to win 2 seats or less. There was some polling that showed 0 seats at the time. And obviously, they got a few more than that. But, I've talked to Kathleen Wynne about this. I've talked to David Hurley about this. I've talked to a number of people about this, that the polling that David had and that Kathleen saw at the time said yes, she was likely going to lose the election, but no other person in the party was more likely to win the election. And I suspect there was probably very similar polling about Justin Trudeau at the time. Was that the case? Mark Carney was sort of in the wings. Chrystia Freeland was sort of in the wings. Were there other options that were more palatable in the polling at the time, or was it really a question of Trudeau or bust?
Well, I mean, yeah, the quick answer to that is no. There wasn't necessarily someone who would be a deciding savior. And I think that's not, that should be expected, given that the government was, nine years old. Lifetime expectancy of governments these days, if you get to 8 or 10 years, that's pretty darn good. So no real surprise there. Always have to remember that, as he's just alluded to, Mr. Carney was sort of on the sidelines, but it was certainly was not the favorite to become the next leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, and that was also true at the beginning of January, by the way, of 2025. I mean, it took a few weeks until it became clear that he was going to run away with it. So lots of things up in the air, I would say, in 2024 as to what the best route forward might be. It's one of the things that Mr. Poilievre is going through this at the moment to a certain extent, right? I mean, he's in a very difficult political position, but it's not obvious who would be in a better one.
For sure. And I find, that is often the case, that usually a leader will stick around until there is another obvious option in the window. Political parties are not prone to jettison their leaders too early. I want to ask you about the moment that you found out that there was going to be a new leader of the Liberal Party, because, I talked to Sachet about this, and he got a call in the night, and I think it was in the morning actually, and was like, hey, this is about to happen. When did you find out, and what was your immediate thoughts about what that meant for the party, what that meant for you and your role, what that meant for the campaign that was, just around the corner?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, we'd been working from December 16th all the way through Christmas into the New Year. We'd been working to try and shore up support in the caucus and the party at large. It became very clear that was not going to be successful. But it wasn't for lack of trying to see if there was a pathway to stay in place. The Prime Minister clearly was thinking about that. Prime Minister Trudeau was thinking about that all the way through Christmas and into the New Year. And he called me the evening before he made the public announcement to say that that's what he intended to do. He had made the decision at that point, and was calling to let me know what that meant in terms of his expectation for the following weeks or months. Although, of course, that would be out of his hands in terms of when the actual leadership would take place, when there would be a new leader in place, etc. That's up to the party, not him. But he called me the evening before, and so we had a short but very nice conversation about that.
So the leadership race kicks off. The party is doing a whole bunch of different elements of that, setting up the timelines, the tithes, et cetera, et cetera. What does it look like from your end? Because you still got to prepare for this campaign. You don't know if you'll be replaced as campaign director, but for time being, you're in charge of this campaign happening. How did you keep it on track with all the preparations, just given the distraction of the leadership race? Because that's pulling volunteers, it's pulling staff, people are leaving. This is what people forget, that like people abandon ship to go to the campaigns, and then suddenly you're like, oh, okay, we got to keep this afloat. How did you keep everything on track during that period?
Yeah, so a couple of things that people won't necessarily think about. And first of all, until March the 9th, which is the date that was eventually picked as the date for the new leader to be put in place, my boss was the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, which was Justin Trudeau. So still working closely with him in terms of making sure the party was in the best position possible once the new leader was chosen. Second thing is that it was clear to me and to Marjorie and to Razam and to others over Christmas, but into January, once Prime Minister Trudeau had made his decision known, that one of the predetermining factors, what the gating question in a way for whether or not it was going to be possible to be successful in an election campaign in 2025, was that the leadership race itself had to be seen as credible. And you'll recall, in January of last year, there was a lot of debate whether that was possible because of foreign interference, what that meant in terms of interference with the vote, all those sorts of things. So first of all, the process for picking the leader had to be robust and seen to be so. And I'm happy to say that Azam and his team especially put in place a system that by the time we actually went through it, if there were any complaints at all, it was because it was too robust. For some people, it became very difficult to vote in the leadership election. Only a few, but that was really important because whoever was chosen had to be seen to be the credible choice of the party, as opposed to something that had been interfered with. So a lot of time, effort, and money was spent on that. Second, I went to the National Caucus meeting in Ottawa in mid-January. I think it was maybe the third week in January of 2025. And I gave a presentation to the caucus as to how we were planning for doing more than one thing at once. As you say, of course, lots of people were going off working for leadership campaigns. It's true on the campaign side of the Liberal Party of Canada, we had to get involved with the leadership campaign. So I was very much involved in putting together the debates, for example, the leadership debates, and what the structure and process for those would be. I was very much involved in figuring out how we were going to do the actual leadership event itself in March. So, that was taking a lot of my time, mostly taking it away from campaign-specific planning, but in a way they are one and the same thing, because it all had to be successful in order for a campaign to be successful. Anyway, going back to the caucus meeting in January, I said to them, look, here are the elements that I think we have to put together as a party to have a successful campaign. All the things you would know, Teresa. And I said, look, it's a challenge, obviously, to put together all of this without knowing who your leader is going to be in a few months' time. And remember, the one part of the context here is that the opposition, it being a minority parliament, the opposition had already said that they were going to defeat the government in late March. That was already a reality. So we already knew there's going to be an election in March, April. There was no way to get out of that. I mean, you just had to prepare for that moment. So you know exactly what you had to do and what your timeline was. I said to the caucus, we don't know who the leader is going to be. We especially did not know the third week of January who the leader was going to be. And we will put together all of the elements of the campaign that one can without knowing who the leader would be. So we will have a campaign in the box to hand over to the incoming leader and to his or her team, that you can just add in all the pieces that are specific to a leader and their brand and their positioning and their issue set. But all the other pieces will be as far along down the road as possible. So that was what we worked on. And then the additional part to that, of course, is that knowing there was an election campaign coming in March, end of March, we had to get moving on deploying some campaign elements like paid advertising in February, without knowing who the new leader would be. And so we did that. We deployed a fairly large paid advertising campaign. By definition, that advertising campaign could not be about our leader. So it had to be about them, and it had to be about trying to define the other side in a certain way. And you may recall these ads, but we put on a set of ads around what Mr. Poilievre had said in public, that was so very similar to what Mr. Trump also was saying in public about a full range of issues, and showing why Mr. Poilievre, in his own words, was so like Mr. Trump. And I think that was good scene setting in terms of level setting for the campaign to come. It was very clear that the ballot question by February and March, far before the actual election campaign was called, was set. The ballot question was at least our ballot question was set in terms of who was best equipped to deal with the threat from the US, and specifically who was best equipped to deal with Donald Trump. So knowing all of that and liking that as a ballot question for us, trying to make sure that whatever we did out there in the public sphere as a campaign before a new leader was chosen aligned with that and begin to set the stage for what was to come.
I'm going to get there in a second, but I do want to get a little bit into the selection of the leader himself, because it was a whirlwind race. I've been a part of such races before. Mm-hmm. They're very tough on the people running them. But, it meant that very quickly you had a new leader to adjust to. So originally you're planning this campaign for, a veteran political operator at this point who's done multiple campaigns, is very familiar with the process. And then you have to pivot to somebody who's never been in politics whatsoever, besides, behind the scene on the bureaucratic side. What was transitioning that like? Because there's a lot of expectations that I expect you have that the leader will understand that perhaps, Carney's a very smart guy, so he was obviously going to figure things out quickly. But at the same time, he doesn't have that built-in experience on the political side that some folks might have. Even just, glad handling a crowd, like that's a very different experience than he was used to. What was that transition like?
Well, I mean, like my first reflection on that is that the Liberal Party of Canada is usually pretty good, not perfect, but pretty good on choosing the right person to be their leader at the right moment. In the same way that the party chose Mr. Trudeau to be leader for the moment. He was the right person for the moment. I mean, and recall him bringing the party back from third place to majority government. I mean, by definition, the party did well in choosing him. I think that was true too in this most recent leadership race in last year. I mean, the party understood quite quickly what was required for the moment. I always use the word moment. The moment is such a underwhelming word for what we're going through at the moment. It's really it's really what we're going through in our age. I mean, it's far more than a moment. Weightier word than that. But for sure understood who they were choosing, and there's no doubt that's why his victory was so huge. An immense victory. You're right; it was short, but intense leadership campaign. But to get over 85% of the vote, quite astounding, really. But I think that's because people understood what they were getting, and so to a certain extent. Some of the big pieces that were important in terms of the way we believed the campaign was going to unfold, although as always, you have to make sure it unfolds the way you want it to, or try to make it unfold in a certain way, were taken care of through him. I mean, perfect candidate for the moment in so many different ways. Don't need to repeat all of that to your audience, because people understand that. I think intuitively, they understood it intuitively at the time of the election campaign. So your question is an important one, but perhaps less important than usual in terms of what was necessary to do with him as a candidate. It's very difficult to run to be Prime Minister the first time you do it. It's unique that someone would win a leadership in the way that Mr. Carney did, and then go on into a campaign in the way he did in such short order, just a couple of weeks after being elected leader and having never been in politics before, then being in your first national election campaign, quite astounding. It is also true that Mr. Carney had a very strong team around him, people with experience, people who had experienced success in both leadership elections and general elections before. That team, by the way, became part of the campaign team that we went forward with after Mr. Carney became leader. He did ask me to stay on as campaign co-director. I got two other excellent campaign co-directors, André Lynn-Hallé and Braden Cayley, who are now both deputy chief of staff in the Prime Minister's office. But so the team was buttressed. The campaign team was buttressed by excellent people from Mr. Carney's leadership campaign, but also other leadership campaigns as well. As you know, that always has to happen. because you have to use all the talents available, and you need to get that from every part of the spectrum in terms of who'd been working on a leadership campaign. All of that had to happen in a very accelerated fashion. He has many strengths, and people have seen Mr. Carney's strengths on offer almost daily since he became leader and prime minister. The one I would really concentrate on in terms of the context of your question is, he has, from my perspective, this incredible ability to learn more quickly than anybody else I've seen in my life. I mean, it's quite incredible how quickly he picks up on all of the pieces that sometimes in the political world anyway, it takes people a fair bit of time to understand why you do this when that happens, or why you don't do this when that happens. So he's incredibly adept at absorbing, picking up, and then operating on the basis of what is in front of them in a way that I think I've probably never seen before, in a very specific sense in terms of how quickly he can learn.
Well, it's kind of interesting because when he first became prime minister, I think media pundits, the general public expected him to be bad at it, not because, he lacked skill, but because he was new. And I think it's very similar to how Trudeau was kind of seen when he first became leader. People figured he was a lightweight, that he wouldn't be able to compete on the same level as somebody of, Stephen Harper's stature. And that quickly proved not true. And I think people, maybe there's a little bit of, overperforming, low expectations, and how that can help you, but also he was just very good as a politician, like pretty much out of the gate. What surprised you the most about Mark Carney as a politician?
Yeah, so look, I think you're right, by the way, and low expectations are always useful. There's no doubt about that, especially in politics. But I don't think the expectations were that low around Mr. Carney, mostly because of him being him. I mean, people understood his resume, his breadth of experience, the jobs he's held before, and why they were applicable to the difficult situation the country found itself in. And I think because of the context of the threat from the US and how Canada was positioned and what needed to happen to make sure that we were able to drive through all of that, also meant that people the general public and voters were perhaps more forgiving than usual in the way that things were playing out. I think that I've never thought of Mr. Carney as being an anti-politician, but I have thought of him as being an unpolitician, and I think that was useful for the moment as well. I don't think that was a negative. I think that was a positive. I think people like to see their leader doing things perhaps in a different way than might normally be done in political terms. And I think that the way he operates and the way he has operated for the last year has met the moment. Use that terrible word again. In terms of what people expect from their prime minister, is dealing with things that we have never not had to deal with before, but not even had to think about dealing with before. So it's not like we had a plan in our back pocket for this craziness. You're dealing with it as you go and trying to make sure you're as well positioned as possible as a government to put Canada and Canadians in the best position. And I think that the reason why he is popular now and is in the position he is politically is because people like it and they respect it. And perhaps the respect is even more important than the like.
I want to touch on that unpolitician piece because, you mentioned that the opposition had signaled they were going to call an election no matter what. They were going to bring down the government. They did back off on that once they saw Carney was very popular. So, there was questions about whether they would actually go through with that. But in theory, they had committed to that. And the prime minister, he was then prime minister, he got elected. He became prime minister only a few days after becoming the leader of the party. And then an election was called not that long after that, but it wasn't immediate. There was some question about whether he would immediately call an election or whether he would, go into the job for a little bit longer. And in those few days, there was only a handful of them, I kept thinking of John Turner and the question of when to call that election and how long you want to stay in and put your stamp on things, or how quickly you should actually just go to the polls, get a new mandate, and govern from there. What was the decision making behind that? Why didn't you immediately go to the polls? Was it a question of needing some time to get his feet under him? What was the thinking of that? Because I know he did go on some international trips and sort of, lay into that experience first before he went back to the campaign trail. Was that an important part that needed to get done beforehand?
Yes, most definitely.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I thought it was crucial for Mr. Carney to take on the mantle of the prime ministership and show himself as prime minister, mostly because he had not been an elected politician before. So people need to see what that looked like, in my view, as opposed to being a leadership candidate, which is of a different nature. And unlike Mr. Turner, who had been elected and been an MP and been finance minister, all those things, nobody had seen Mr. Carney as an elected leader. And I thought, the more you could show how you would act as prime minister, put that on the record, make it clear how you would interact with other foreign leaders, make it clear what you saw as being priorities for the country, not just through the lens of a leadership campaign, but actually as prime minister. All those things very, very important. Those 2 weeks or so, a lot was packed into them for that purpose. I think the idea of making his prime ministership real was very, very important in terms of then going into a campaign as prime minister, as opposed to just as the new leader of the Liberal Party of Canada.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because when you think about a campaign in a crisis, it's about asking people whether they want to change course or whether they want to double down on what's happening, have the security of the current plan, the current leadership. And I think making him prime minister for at least a few weeks beforehand really does solidify that you're going to actually have to make a choice to move away from the safety we have right now under this man. I want to talk about those first 10 days. So, people who don't do campaigns don't necessarily know. There's usually a 7 to 10 day rollout that's planned from the beginning. Sometimes it shifts, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes with good effect or ill effect about whether or not that shift happens. But there is a plan in place, and you're actioning against that plan. And then, once that plan is over, you start to pivot based on what's going on in the campaign. What did that rollout look to you when you were setting it up? How much did those first couple of weeks play into that? Obviously, the ballot question was always going to be about Trump. How did you organize around that idea?
Yeah, I mean, sort of two things. First of all, again, going to sort of base practical items. And for us, with a new leader, with very little time between having a new leader and election campaign starting, it was perhaps even more important than usual that the first few days all went off without a hitch. There wasn't at all a mistake. There wasn't, all those things that campaigns can get sidelined by. That none of that would happen. That the campaign would roll out perfectly, so that with a new leader who hadn't done before, we could concentrate on that as opposed to having to concentrate on whether or not the campaign itself was running properly. We achieved that. I mean, we did have a clean rollout, and nothing went wrong in the first few days. That sometimes can happen. As we said, I mean, and you just repeated. I mean, it was very clear what we thought the ballot question should be, what we wanted it to be, and where we were most strongly positioned around who could deal with the threat from the South and who could deal with Mr. Trump specifically. That meant that we needed to build upon what Mr. Carney had built up, certainly during the leadership campaign. His leadership campaign was very much about that. The language that he's been using, as recently as yesterday, and recorded on Monday after he did his forward guidance piece. That language has been familiar and consistent for well over a year, right? So it was making sure that in the campaign we kept on giving him and the campaign an opportunity to talk about both what the situation was, what was coming at us, and be honest and brutal with the fact of that, what it meant for Canada, what it meant we had to do in the face of that, and what it was that Mr. Carney could offer to try and make sure that got done. So or that infused all the regular pieces of the campaign as to where the tour would go, what you would be announcing, or as much as possible in that space, not exclusively in that space, as we'll come back to probably later on in this conversation, but as much as possible stay in that realm of, here's what we believe the ballot question is, here's what we're doing today. That will show you one more element of how Mr. Carney himself will respond to that and the tools that he's going to make available to himself and to the government to get it done.
Well, and it very much became, whatever the policy was of the day, Canada strong, right? Like, it was that theme of, how does this make Canada stronger? Even if it's just, going to our national parks and embracing our natural heritage and all those things. Everything came back to that narrative of, we are a strong, independent country. Midway through the campaign, though, things started to shift. So Trump, obviously, we kind of forget that the tariffs had been threatened for a while, but they largely came into place at the start of March of that year. So this was a very live issue in the start of the campaign. Mm-hmm. But then Trump started to figure out, I think people perhaps told him that, hey, you're actually harming the prospects of Conservatives in this Canadian election. And they're your natural allies based on having shared, policies about things. Perhaps you should quiet down so that you don't lose the chance of getting Conservatives in office in Canada. So he did quiet down for a bit, and the second half of the campaign was a little less focused on him because he wasn't in the headlines every day, which meant that cost of living came back as an issue. And I did go look back in preparation for this conversation to see what policies the party was rolling out under Carney at this time. And because in my head, I remembered like, oh no, it was all about Trump. But I went back and looked, and no, there was cost of living stuff every week. There was all kinds of things about social issues. Like, this was a well-rounded platform and a well-rounded release schedule that perhaps in the moment when you're looking at the headlines, you didn't necessarily feel all that, but those planks were there. How did you pivot in those second 2 weeks to talk about some of the other issues that were bubbling up?
Well, look, I'm glad you look back at that, because I think it's right. We always knew that even though the Trump issue was our best ballot question, we also knew that wasn't the most important issue to Canadians. It's an interesting dichotomy, that, and what you do about that as a campaign is always interesting. If I take a step back, for example, there've been many campaigns over the decades where voters will put up healthcare being the number one issue top of mind. There've been very, very few healthcare election campaigns, so that it doesn't always align. The top issue that people say they have aligns with what the campaign is going to be about. Most important thing to always remember in a campaign. But it was true that Mr. Poilievre had been successful in attaching himself to cost of living issues and put forward, if not a plan, certainly a set of slogans and an agenda that were meant, from their point of view, to address that. So it was one of the reasons, from our campaign's perspective, and people, liberals argue about this, but it was very important from my perspective that we actually did put out a platform. Some liberals, some with lots of experience said, well, why did you put out the platform? I mean, you only wanted it to be a one-issue campaign. True, we did only want it to be a one-issue campaign, but it wasn't just a one-issue campaign. There was other issues that were bubbling away there, and if we go to the end point of the the entire election, let's remember what the final result was. It was very clear that it wasn't all about one ballot question. Otherwise, Mr. Poilievre would not have achieved a vote over 40%. So certainly we were trying to make sure we must, on the one hand, had U.S. sovereignty, etc., in the window as much as possible. Also had announcements and pieces of the platform that addressed cost of living, but beyond cost of living, also addressed crime and security issues, which were important in wide swaths of the country, especially wide swaths of suburban Canada. So we always believed it was impossible for us to only talk about one thing and not address those other things at all. And if we didn't address those other things at all, it would have been a weakness and an opening for Mr. Poilievre, and probably not sustainable. And also add, though, beyond that, I mean, I always believe that if we put out a platform, platforms came out late in that election campaign, but if we put out a platform then be more likely that the Conservatives would be obliged to do so as well. That to me was not a wasted day. If I go back one step again, this was probably the first election campaign for me as a Liberal where we went into the campaign ahead in the polls. Usually we're behind, usually we're the underdog, and usually we have to figure out a way to clamber back up the poll, right?
Yeah.
And so usually what that means, and this is really important because I think it affects the way you approach what you're going to do day by day. Usually you go into campaigns and you have to figure out how you're going to win the day because you're trying to make up ground. That was not the case here. We already had a pole position. We were winning, and there wasn't a moment in the campaign from our perspective and our numbers where we weren't winning. So that meant you didn't have to win every day. It meant you had to win at least as much as the other guys if you want to consolidate your position. But you could also have neutral days, where nobody had an effect. So platform day at worst for us was going to be, from my perspective, a neutral day. It was going to allow us to have all these other pieces to deal with a broader issue set than just sovereignty alone. And it hopefully would mean that the Conservatives would bring out a platform of their own, and they wouldn't have a neutral day. If they did so, they'd have a bad day, and that's the way it played out. They didn't have a great day on their platform day. Our platform day was at worst a neutral day, but I would say went beyond that. But it also gave us tools that we required for the rest of the campaign in order to stay in the game.
I want to talk about the opposition a bit because in a campaign, like you said, there's all the stuff that you're proactively doing on behalf of your party and what you're trying to achieve in the election. But then, in addition to the sword, there's also the shield side of things. You're trying to defend on certain issues and against what the opposition is trying to do to you. And, Poilievre was a very polarizing figure in this election before and after it. But I think a lot of Canadians didn't necessarily know who he was. He was just going to be the next prime minister, and they didn't have to look too much into it beyond that. And then suddenly the campaign happens, and there's a real race, and he's a bit more under the microscope. There were some pretty famous comments he made on various stops of his tour that didn't land well, particularly with women. But he was leading on some issues as well. You mentioned some of them, crime, things like that. And he was connecting with voters to a significant degree. Again, he got more votes than any Conservative leader in the history of that party. So it wasn't that he was completely unpopular. And, I've been in elections where the campaign team just doesn't want to go after their opponent. They think those are their strengths. We can't possibly bring them down, so we won't even bother. And that tends to cede issues to them. You were just talking about how the party refused to cede those issues to Poilievre and the Conservatives. And I think that was a big part of the party actually winning. You said that the Conservatives didn't have a strategy problem. They actually ran a pretty good campaign. What they had was a leadership problem where Poilievre, while he connected with a lot of people, didn't connect with a lot of other people. How did you play into that over the course of the campaign?
Yeah, I mean, look, I for sure, I did always think that for him and for his party, he had the right issue set, and he was concentrating on them in the right way. I mean, I've always believed, I believed in the campaign as well, that if he had tried to shift gears and try to fight on our ground and try to prove out that he was the best choice to take on Trump and all of those pieces that Mr. Carney obviously outperformed him on in people's minds, I think that would have been a mistake for Mr. Poilievre, and I think he would have had a worse result. So, from our perspective, that meant on the one hand, we had to put up a bunch of shields, hopefully more than shields, but at least shields on crime and immigration and other things. I mean, when I say shield, it's not because it's not substantive policy. It is. It's just you don't necessarily expect to win on it because of where the other side is. It's not because it's taken seriously. Whilst trying to make sure that we kept in the window as much as possible what we could on the sovereignty side, and using that to give as much life and evidence to Mr. Carney's strengths as they were already assumed by the electorate, to keep on lifting that up. It's I think it's also true that in terms of growth, Mr. Poilievre's personal political persona isn't necessarily all that useful when going up against an opponent like Mr. Carney. They're obviously very different sorts of people. They obviously attract different sorts of support on the content side, but on the political personality side, a big difference there. From our perspective, we tried to carry through the campaign, especially through paid advertising, the idea that Mr. Poilievre was far too close to Mr. Trump and his ideas to ever be able to defend Canada and its sovereignty and its interests in the way that Mr. Carney could. And I think that landed, and I think that was something that the Conservatives didn't do much about. I mean, people during the campaign, some Liberals and some Conservatives saying, well, Poilievre should shift gears and play on different grounds. Not sure that's right. After the campaign, some of those people changed their mind and said, well, actually, what we're trying to say was he should just be less Trumpy. Well, sure. But, he's on the public record for saying things in so many similar ways on so many similar issues. It was difficult for him to do that as well, I would say, as apparently it remains still difficult to do, as he's been through various resets, put them in quotation marks because they don't usually last longer than a few days or a week, because I think he literally has problems trying to align all of that with who he is as a political person.
Yeah, I think, the main thing that works in politics is authenticity. And if he can't get into that, it's because it's not authentically who he is. And I think that will be a struggle for him going forward. We're going to come back to him. But I want to also talk about, the so-called progressive primary. So this is something that happens every election where, progressive voters who swing between the Liberals, the NDP, and whoever else, they look at the campaign and how it's going and decide where best to park their vote to stop the Conservatives from winning. There was a big swing of support away from the NDP in this election. People forget that Jagmeet Singh was at 20% in the polls around the time that Trudeau was stepping down. And that quickly evaporated as Mark Carney came onto the scene and people were concerned about sovereignty and all these things. But there was a point where they might have taken over that support and been competitive in this campaign. Do you think that's the reason for their collapse in this campaign, that it was just this question of the sovereignty moment, that progressive voters just fled to the Liberals because they thought that is the best option to stop Poilievre and also Trump, or are there problems deeper than that? Was there something else at play for them in this campaign?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I mean, when you talk about the NDP was getting up into the low 20s, I think the highest was sort of mid 20s, high 20s for a couple of weeks there over Christmas and stuff. But that was momentary. And it's certainly true that over the course of the year prior, in a world where the Liberal government was at its weakest, the NDP was never very strong. So to a certain extent, it seems to me that what happened in the election campaign was sort of preset. I mean, it was exacerbated by the context of the Canada-US situation, and it becoming a binary choice, really, Liberal or Conservative, in the face of that threat, and in the face of Mr. Trump. I don't know. I think obviously they got squeezed out. The reasons why they got squeezed out, I think, is multiple. I think there's obviously they decided for themselves they had a leadership issue. They certainly weren't able to translate the gains they had made for their voter base and I'd say for the country through the supply and confidence agreement with the Liberals. Not able to translate that progress, whether it's on dental. I mean, there's a whole range of pieces that wouldn't necessarily have happened without that agreement being in place. It's always difficult to translate that into political support, but obviously they were unable to do so in a way that made sense to folks, and probably again the realities of those successes were totally diminished in the face of what became the overarching issue once we get past November of 2024. So it didn't feel like there was much of a primary, to be frank, prior to or during the last federal election. It would almost seemed like it had been preordained as to it being a binary choice, and certainly that never changed over the course of the writ itself. But even in the weeks leading up to it, it seemed to be that was the case.
So I want to talk about, the last week or so of the campaign. So you get into advanced polls, and that's usually where the final decisions are getting made about how you're going to tweak the campaign, where you're going to send resources, to try and tip certain races across the country. Because by that point, you have some good data coming in about how things are going. Advanced polls obviously inform that, but there's not a lot of time between advanced polls and election day itself. So a lot of those decisions get baked in. I guess I have two questions. One, what was your reaction to the Conservative golf ad? Because I think that signaled where things were going. And two, how did you decide, where you wanted to send more resources in? Because, of course, there's a lot of bodies that can be moved around. There's more money that can be sent places, et cetera, et cetera. How did you decide where the party was going to focus in the final stretch?
Well, maybe let's deal with the golf ad first, because I don't have much to say about it other than it didn't seem like much of a threat. That's for sure. when you see that for the first time, when
you saw that, were you like, "Oh, they're in trouble and they know it"?
Well, yes, it was the narrowest of narrow casting, right? Presumably they did that on purpose, and assuming they did do it on purpose, that meant that they were worried about where they were heading. Given the final result, perhaps more worried than they should have been. But no, that ad was, you take everything seriously in an election campaign, but that didn't seem to demand as much seriousness as other things. Going back to your bigger question, your broader question about, how you deploy resources and what that means over the course of the back end of a campaign. I mean, by the time you get into the second week of the campaign, think of it as 5 weeks. By the time you get halfway through that, you have enough data as a senior group to meet 2 or 3 times a week together with the regional campaigns, the regional campaign directors, and literally go through riding by riding on where we think they're at, because you'd have so many data points like that. I mean, you obviously have a public opinion polling, you have your own opinion polling, you have whatever numbers you're getting from the ground, a bunch of other pieces like who your candidate might be, how strong they are or not, regional, local dynamics, etc. You literally 2 or 3 times a week going through the entire list of ridings and deciding the degree to which resources were to be deployed, and resources of every kind, not just people, but digital advertising, for example, broader advertising, all the pieces of a campaign that you can actually click and point to certain places in real time. So that didn't change that much by the time we got into the last 7 or 10 days, because we had a wide array of places where we could make gains happily across the country. So trying to make sure that we were putting additional resources in the places that were closest to that threshold point of getting over the hump, to put an individual riding into the win column, is always, there's a lot of that is fact-based. Some of it goes beyond fact into what your gut is saying too about certain places and what's happening and what you're hearing. I think that if you look at the final results, if there were surprises on the positive side, I wouldn't say that there were that many surprises. There weren't that many places where we hadn't added additional resources, which we ended up winning, even though some of them we thought we may not win because they were out there, but we thought we could, like Northumberland, for example. So, there were ridings where we put additional resources because we thought we could get over that hump, and we did. There are other ridings where we thought we were at risk, where in York Region, for example, York Region always being the most difficult part of the GTA for the Federal Liberal Party, for Liberals generally, actually. So we knew we were at risk there. We didn't necessarily think we were going to lose what we lost in the same way we didn't think we would be as close in Brampton as we ended up being. But some of that is, individual riding or clumps of riding effect, as opposed to it being regionalized or obviously a provincial issue. So some of that is hard to identify. The reality is that by the time we get to election day, we knew that the top line polls had closed a little bit. We thought we could still be in the running to get a majority, but it wasn't a sure thing. That it could also be very close to getting a majority, which meant the individual ridings are even more important in terms of your question and making sure you've got that right into where you're putting resources. Now, the flip side of that discussion is that, it's been sort of generally accepted. I think I would accept it as well, that in York Region, for example, crime issues and immigration issues were far, far outweighed the Canada-US ballot question. And therefore, we lost ground there. Same with Brampton, you add that together with cost of living, which far outweighed the Canada-US piece. So, some people would argue, well, that means you should have doubled down even further on the Canada-US situation, doubled and tripled and quadrupled down as much as we could on that. I don't know how much more it would have been possible to do. Whilst also, as we said before, trying to deal with those other issues, which people saw as their own individual ballot box question, trying to make sure we had an answer for some of those issues, and turned out that the Conservatives had better answers than us for some of those voters' minds.
Do you think there's anything you really could have done? Because, we're just thinking of the eventual result was a minority. And again, minorities sometimes happen of that size. They sometimes happen by, a couple hundred votes here or there and, 5 ridings, that kind of thing. Like, it's a very small difference in certain communities that's actually swings the result. Do you think the party could have done any different? Because I grew up in York Region. I grew up in one of the ridings that went Conservative. And when I think about that area, what preceded this was, a rash of carjackings. Like, there was a lot of specific types of crime happening in York Region during this time that had really put pressure on people's sense of safety, regardless of what was happening internationally. They didn't feel safe at home. And it doesn't surprise me that those issues kind of drove the agenda in those ridings and ultimately shifted things to Poilievre. I think Poilievre in general did better in Ontario than people expected. And in hindsight, hindsight's 2020, but I just can't think of what the party really could have done over the course of a campaign that would have shifted that narrative enough to change those minds. I don't know if you've, in the year since have dreamt about some kind of solution that might have changed it.
Right. Well, look, I mean, the first thing I'd have to say is it is a reality that it is very, very difficult to obtain a majority government in Canada, particularly in an election. Sometimes you can do it afterwards, but in an election it's particularly hard. And I think there's a range of reasons for that, but it's just the political world we live in at the moment. We'll see what that means going forward, as to the extent to which, for example, it's mostly a two-party battle with a Quebec piece layered into election campaigns. We'll see if that's true in the next campaign or not. Who knows where we'll be. That's the first thing. Second thing is, as you asked the question, I was thinking to myself, perhaps, I suppose it'd be nice if my answer included something along the lines of staying up, waking up in the middle of the night and just wishing we'd done this in order to win there. Honestly, I did not experience that. I mean, I'd gone through 6 months of going from where I thought, the prognosis was pretty grim to an election where we won 169 seats, which nobody would have believed 3 months prior. So it's difficult to have sleepless nights about that. Having said that, yes, I think there's always things you can do. I think there's always things you can probably do locally, in particular. But it wasn't from lack of trying do pieces. If you, for example, if you look at the last few days of the campaign and where Mr. Carney's tour went, we went to those places. Like, it wasn't as if we didn't know that we needed to buttress in York Region, for example. We went to market, so it wasn't that we were blind to it. It wasn't that we weren't trying to do things about it. I always believe that there's other things you can try and figure out to do, be creative around. I'm not sure what they would have been.
So speaking of Markham, it took 50 weeks, but the majority eventually materialized. And, I think it's interesting because it was a very strong majority. And if you look back into history, you'd have to look at the Pearson government to have a similar strength minority government. And there's a lot you can get done with a really, really strong minority. You only need a handful of people to join you to get things passed. The one thing you can't do is feel safe that will always be the case. Yeah. So now that there is a majority, and again, it's a very small majority, which has a lot of the same risks as a super minority. Now that that's the case, how will that impact the country? I think at least for the immediate term, it's going to be a pretty secure majority, just because there's a lot of support for Carney and the government and what they're doing right now. What do you think the impact's going to be on the country of having a majority for the first time in a very long time, in a period of Canadian history where, we've only had two majorities in the last, 20 or so years? What do you think the impact is?
Yeah, I think a few different lenses to look at that through, right? I mean, first of all, I think that for Canadians, in terms of how they perceive their government over the course of the last year, I think for most of that time, they have thought almost as if it was a majority government in terms of the position they held Mr. Carney to be in, that he was in control of both politics and government in the country for the last year. So I don't think it changes the perspective that people will have on the government per se. That's different from your main part of the question as to what it means for the country, which I'll come back to. What it means for the government is very important. I've worked in minorities and majorities, but in minorities both provincially and federally, both in government and in opposition. And when you're in government as a minority, you have to expend a fair bit of time and energy on figuring out how to make sure you stay in government as opposed to being defeated, what that means in terms of the agenda for the government, but also the processes that are in place in the interactions you have with opposition parties whom you need the support of one way or another. That varies depending on your political position versus their political position. It's always easier if you're in a strong political position. It's very difficult if you're in a weak one. And so the way that, having gained even a small majority now, what matters in terms of the government and how it acts internally is key. It means you have more time to plan. It doesn't mean you take more time to get things done, but it does mean you have more time to figure out what we're going to do beyond the first top three things on the that are issues of the day. Still have to do those three things, but you can be expansive and go beyond that and do more than one thing at once, do more than three things at once, do in fact the 20 or 30 things at once that are required for a government to be successful and for a country to be governed properly. I hope that actually is the biggest outcome from the majority being gained, is that the government as a whole will now find the energy to concentrate on more than what it's had to concentrate on in its first year, which is done well, but needs to expand that to a full range of all the responsibilities of the government. I think that for the country, what it means is who knows if this government will go to the fall of 2029. I don't know if it's going to go for 3.5 years or not, but probably a year or two, I would suspect, and I think there's an expectation from Canadians that forget about this partisan politics stuff and the possibility of elections. Get on with getting done what all of you have said, for whatever party you're in, all of you have said needs to happen for Canada to get into a stronger position relative to the threats that are coming at us from the US and from other places, and to give time to get some of those things done, because some of what's important in terms of what the government has to achieve, what the country has to achieve, are time consuming, and aren't going to be complete by July 1st this year or January 1st of next year. That it needs to have continued effort on execution to make sure we achieve some of those outcomes that have both been promised but are absolutely necessary if we're going to be successful as a country. So I think for the country, I think that's useful. I think it's useful not to have to be distracted by election campaigns in the midst of all that. It's difficult for governments to get things done around, not just during an election campaign, but prior to it and immediately thereafter. So I think we've gained some time for things to get done, which I think is useful.
Well, I wanted your thought on that because as soon as the by-elections were a resounding victory for the government, there was this narrative out there that Carney should now call a general election. And that seemed insane to me because you have the power you need to actually get things done. And he's always been seen as, as you said, an unpolitician who's not focused on the partisan gamesmanship and trying to figure out all that. And he even said he wasn't going to do a new throne speech and reset the committees and all that kind of stuff. So he seems very uninterested in playing the political game. Obviously, they're very high in the polls and you would love to go get, a 200 plus seat majority. But I think the moment doesn't demand that. And I think his personality doesn't work with that really either.
Yeah,
would you be advising a campaign right now?
No, I would not. I'm in total agreement with you. As tempting as it might be, right, to take advantage of what appears to be consensus opinion around where the country is at and the degree to which Mr. Carney is supported, as tempting as it might be, I think there are far more important things in play than the relative position of the Liberal Party of Canada versus other parties in the makeup of our House of Commons. And I think people understand that intuitively, and I think they understand that Mr. Carney understands that. And it's not just keeping in the same space as being the unpolitician. It goes beyond that. That's a big part of it, but it goes beyond that. That if you're actually serious about doing what needs to happen this moment in Canada's history for the country, as the Prime Minister has been expressing, and I believe he is, then an election doesn't fit in with that. Now, is it possible that other parties, opposition parties, do things that make an election more necessary? Potentially. Don't think that's the case today. We'll see over the course of time what plays out. It's also possible that events occur that demand going to the people to ask for a mandate to deal with them beyond what we're currently dealing with. I mean, no, you can't look into the future and not know that's not going to happen. So I'm not ruling out an election in the next 6 months, year, 2 years. I mean, it's possible that events will unfold in a way that a new mandate is needed, but I certainly don't see that right now, and certainly I've been very glad that was not the natural reaction of the Prime Minister.
So I have one last question about the campaign before I ask my last question of the podcast, but where would you rank this campaign in your sort of history of campaigns that you've participated in, both from like a fun perspective and also from a meaningfulness perspective? Because, I don't think it's complete puffery to say that this kind of did save the country, this election victory. You might take issue with that, but I think it was a particularly important election result in the fact that everyone who got on board did. But also from a personal level, you've done a lot of campaigns at this point. Was this one a fun one? Did you enjoy doing it? Would you, hold this in high regard?
Oh yes, for sure I would. I mean, yes, it was fun. It was working with a dream team on the campaign side, who worked well together. I agree with that. I think the result was very important for the country. The only thing I'd say was different from other campaigns is that it perhaps wasn't as exciting because, as I said before, we were in the lead from the beginning and we never sort of lost the lead. It wasn't like. So, for example, it wasn't like 2014 where we weren't expected to win and then we won the majority and shocked and surprised people, even though we thought we knew how we could get there, and never really knew, even on election day, that it was necessarily going to happen. So that element of politics is always very exciting if you're not quite sure if you're going to win or lose. it's obviously far better to think you're going to win and be pretty certain you're going to win. I've been in election campaigns where I've been pretty certain we're going to lose. So on that front, it was a great campaign too. And we figured out how to put together a winning campaign that 6 months prior, 3 months prior, even no one would have contemplated as being possible. A lot of that, of course, is due to Mr. Carney and his strength as a candidate and now as a Prime Minister. But it goes beyond Mr. Carney. I mean, in terms of a team and team of candidates, campaign, all of whom have their own campaign teams, a central campaign that had to work well. So to that extent, it was a very fulfilling campaign to be involved in. I thought the result was important. I was happy with the result. It was difficult to be disappointed that we didn't get a majority. So all in all, yes, no, I liked it very much. That's a different thing, but though, by the way, than thinking I want it all again. There's a time and a place for each campaign. Happily, by definition, the next one will be different. Different set of issues, different set of characters, different level of national importance or international importance, if we can put it that way.
So in the aftermath of this campaign, you've left politics to return to the private sector. Now, we'll see if that's a permanent thing or not, because, it's always hard to get out of politics, but it does allow you to look back at your time, both in government and on, political campaigns and think about what made those successes, what you would do differently, all that kind of stuff. When I think of the time that I worked with you in government, you had a very loyal following of staffers who really looked up to you and, quite frankly, thought the world of you. Like, they're Bevan heads, right? Like that is a thing that exists. There's a lot of people out there who feel that way about you. And I think, even in my time of working with you, when I first got to know you, I was a bit more of a junior staffer. And, you think that campaign directors and people leading campaigns in government should be nice to everybody, but that's not necessarily the case. That doesn't always happen. People aren't always giving of their time. And I always felt that you really, really were. And when I think about what campaigns should be like, I think that kind of approach should be there, where everybody feels like they can weigh in, where everybody feels like they're just as important in the broader project. And I think you always created an environment like that. So I guess my last question is, what advice would you give to people who are going to lead future Liberal campaigns and about, the culture of the campaign that they're going to create?
Well, there's a lot in there. First of all, thank you for being so generous. I feel sorry that somebody might be known as a Bevan head, but anyway, it's a whole new word for me. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, a couple of things I've always tried to remind myself of in politics, in government, in campaigns, wherever it might be, is that and this is true of life, of course, is that people are the most important element of the political world, of the government world. Nothing happens without people, good people doing good things with good leadership. Nothing can come in the way of that or replace it. People are everything. Second thing that is connected to that, which I think part of this is because I played rugby for a long time and into my 30s at a decently high level. And one of the things I learned playing rugby is that it is not always the people on the field who pretend to be the toughest who actually end up being the toughest. And the learning I've always taken from that is being nice and being decent does not mean you cannot also be tough. How you are tough really matters. Knowing that you're able to be so without literally being an asshole. Being an asshole is not the same thing as being tough. If anything, it's the opposite. And it doesn't work in politics and government. You actually don't get, by definition, as in the real world beyond politics, you don't get the best out of people if you treat them poorly. You get the best out of people when you treat them well, with respect, and usually in a way that allows a team to come together and actually want to work together, as opposed to not being able to wait to go home at night. Because the reality is in politics and government and campaigns, you don't get to go home very early anyway. You need to like your workplace and the way it's unfolding. So I you know those two things I think would be have guided me. They've guided me most not least because the first person I worked for in politics was John Godfrey, who was very decent human being, who taught me for the 10 years that I worked for him exactly how one should best interact with people, whether they are your employees or your friends or your colleagues. Always being decent and being respectful. Kathleen, obviously, the same way. So, been very, very lucky, and Stéphane Dion the same. Very lucky in terms of the people I've been able to work for myself in politics and learn from them how best to interact with each other at a human level, and do so with intent. Kathleen, especially in this space, right? I mean, an incredibly impressive human being in so many different ways, but that always take with me the way that she dealt with people, especially on her staff, and what that made us all feel. You experienced it too, just all the way through, all the way to the end. Felt fantastic to be working for her.
Well, and I would say from a staff perspective too, that I've always had the theory that if you're reasonably talented, you work really hard and you're kind to other people, it doesn't matter what kind of cliques or whatever form in politics, people will bring you along. And I think an important part of leadership is creating that environment where kindness, does pay off and is an important part of the community that you're building in politics.
No, I think that's true. I think it's very true. I think politics is one of those places where, intelligence, hardworking, understanding how to work in a team, you can move upward through the ranks consistently by doing all those things. It's also one of the spaces where being hardworking, first of all, there is space to be hardworking, and if you're not, probably won't make it that far in that world.
I can't think of a better note to end on, because that pretty much sums up, I think, both of our times in politics. Thank you so much for spending so much time with me today doing this.
Thank you. You're very welcome. I've really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.